a 70% reduction in the national murder rate. That's what the government of El Salvador claimed in January 2024 following a multi-year crackdown on gangs that has seen the country declare a state of emergency and draft in the military. The country's president, Nayib Bukele, is riding high on a wave of popularity because of this approach to gangs, and it's easy to see why. According to NBC News, official data from El Salvador suggests that around 2,000 people were murdered in the country in 2019. In 2020 and 2021, that number was slashed in half as Bukele's crackdowns truly started to take effect. Killings dropped markedly again in 2022 with just 495, and in 2023 El Salvador recorded its lowest homicide rate in years, just 154 murders committed. That takes the country from having one of the world's highest murder rates to placing it just below Canada as having the lowest. It's an incredible turnaround, and it leads us to an interesting question. What if the United States followed El Salvador's lead and used its military to take on its gang problems? Before we can answer that question, we need to consider a few others. Is it even possible for the military to get involved in what technically is a domestic matter? What types of gangs would the military face, and what would its approach look like? And perhaps the most important question to start, what did El Salvador actually do that could inspire the US to emulate its approach? To answer that question, we need to rewind to April 2016. At that point, El Salvador was estimated to have around 70,000 gang members who actively contributed to the country having one of the world's highest murder rates. Turf wars were rife, with prison even seeming to offer practically no deterrence to the gang leaders. Many were incarcerated, some indefinitely, but were somehow able to run their operations from behind bars. The situation was dire, and it prompted the country's then-president, Salvador Sánchez Cerén, to come up with a plan. On the gang leader side, he presented a bill to El Salvador's Congress that would allow the prison system to isolate gang leaders, restricting visits to family and placing them in cells that limited cell phone signals. He also declared a state of emergency at 7 of the country's prisons, resulting in 299 high-ranking gang members being transferred to other facilities. Then there was the military approach, the announcement of a 1,000-member Special Forces unit to crack down on gangs in the streets. That unit would be equipped with assault weapons, armored cars, and even helicopters, with the country's then Vice President Oscar Ortiz claiming that we're going to go after them in the countryside and in the city. Those were prophetic words, as El Salvador has effectively used its military to take on the country's gangs, even after the election of a new president and vice president. However, the initial crackdown wasn't what did the trick. As we mentioned earlier, El Salvador still saw 2,000 murders in 2019, suggesting Cerén's version of a military approach wasn't working as well as he'd hoped. Enter Nayib Bukele. Elected as El Salvador's president in 2019, Bukele took his predecessor's approach and went running. In March 2022, he implemented a state of emergency across the entire country that essentially gave his government free rein to tackle gangs in whatever way they saw fit. That state of emergency is still in place. Lawmakers extended it for the 24th time in March 2024 to bring it up to more than 2 years, and it appears to have worked. Beyond the lower homicide rates mentioned earlier, Bukele's military crackdown has led to the arrests of thousands of gang members, as well as the destruction of gang communication systems. Hierarchies have been disrupted, which has left gang command structures in disarray. The problem isn't yet solved. Over 21,000 gang members were still at large by the end of 2023. However, more than 70,000 El Salvadoran gang members are now in prison, with Bukele's government having cleared the way to conduct mass trials of up to 900 members at a time, if all those members are accused of the same crime. In essence, we've seen El Salvador accept a state similar to martial law, with a military-driven police force arresting gang members, and its people appear to be happy in that situation. In February 2024, Bukele secured his second term in office by securing a staggering 83% of El Salvador's vote. The question now is simple: could what works for El Salvador and its leader work in the United States? Before tackling that question, we first need to look at the issue of scale. El Salvador's gang problem was massive, with anywhere between 70,000 and 100,000 members in a country that has a population of just under 6.4 million people. That means somewhere between 1% and 2% of the population were gang members before the military crackdown. The US has a very different ratio. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, or DOJ, there were around 1 million gang members spread around 33,000 gangs in 2011. There are no specific figures updating the total number of gang members in the years since, though the FBI now claims that there are 33,000 violent gangs, including those on the streets, in prison, and motorcycle gangs. On the surface, that would suggest America's gang problem isn't as severe as El Salvador's, at least in terms of ratios. 1 million gang members in a country of 340 million people works out to around 0.3% of the population being gang-affiliated, far lower than the 1% or 2% seen in El Salvador. But there are other challenges. Take the sheer number of gangs in the United States as an example. In El Salvador, it's believed that 53 armed groups remain after the government's crackdown. The number wasn't much larger than that before the military got involved, which allowed the country's government to hone in on the largest gangs before taking on some of the smaller organizations. Groups like the Mara Salvatrucha or MS-13 and the 18th Street were obvious targets that could have a military force dedicated to taking them down. The situation would be far more complicated in the US. Despite having fewer gang members per capita, they're spread out among far more gangs. Worse yet, the United States is huge compared to El Salvador, around 467 times larger in terms of landmass. In fact, with that landmass being divided into states that each have their own gangs and laws, introducing the military into that environment would be far more complex in operation than what was seen in El Salvador. Not simply because the military would have to be imposed on every single state, but because each state offers a different level of gang challenge. Of course, the US military is far larger than El Salvador's, which slightly mitigates the issue. Then there are the many groups the US military would need to face. It would take far too long to list all the 33,000, but some of the most prominent include the 18th Street, which is also present in El Salvador, which the DOJ claimed had between 30,000 to 50,000 members in 2008. The Bloods and the Crips, the country's most prominent African-American gangs, combined have a membership that falls anywhere between 35,000 and 55,000. The Gangster Disciples may have as many as 50,000 members, with the Latin Kings also having around 35,000. That's without mentioning many prominent gangs, such as the Hells Angels and the Aryan Brotherhood, that also have memberships in the thousands. The point is that the US military would be facing gangs in some cases that are nearly as large as the combined numbers in El Salvador. Each of those gangs has its own culture, its own hierarchy. That means that a one-size-fits-all approach on taking them on wouldn't work. Each would require the military to devise a specific plan focused on that particular gang, including analysis of member capabilities to enact any sort of plan. Speaking of plans, it's not like the US has nothing in place to combat these gangs already. The FBI alone currently operates 3 major anti-gang initiatives. The National Gang Intelligence Center is one of them. Established in 2005, the organization gathers intelligence on gang activity, which it uses to support law enforcement. It's also responsible for identifying the gangs that present the highest threat to the US at any given time. Granted, it isn't directly responsible for taking on gangs on the streets. That's left to law enforcement and other FBI groups, but the information it holds would be an invaluable resource should the military get involved in America's gang problem. There's also the Transnational Anti-Gang or TAG task forces the FBI has created to directly tackle the 18th Street and MS-13 as they try to expand their influence in the US. You may recognize both as being the main targets of El Salvador's crackdown, and the existence of the TAG task forces shows us that the US takes them very seriously. However, these TAG groups don't operate in the US. They're working in places like El Salvador and Honduras to try to dismantle these gangs in their home bases. Closer to home, the FBI also operates the Violent Gang Safe Streets Task Force, through which it collaborates with local law enforcement agencies to take on gangs at the street level. There are 160 of these task forces spread throughout the country, most of which engage in gathering evidence to build cases against gang members. Consensual monitoring, Title III wiretapping, and financial analysis all fall under the force's remit, vital for providing evidence in firearm investigations, drug conspiracies, and other gang-related crimes. So, not only would any military crackdown have to contend with the sheer number of gangs in the US, but it would also have these anti-gang organizations to consider. Does it cooperate with them, co-opt the information they have before taking over? The odds are that it would be the former, with the government essentially rolling these anti-gang organizations into one giant supporting group for the military. But that brings us to another challenge the military would face: legal issues. The mention of evidence gathering is key here, as the US operates on a system where everybody is considered innocent of a crime until proven guilty. To maintain that system, the military and the government wouldn't be able to replicate actions such as El Salvador approving mass trials that could involve up to 900 suspects at a time. It would be easy to make the argument that this is unconstitutional, and it amounts to stripping away the rights of US citizens. Opposition to military action against gangs would be inevitable. Then there's the Posse Comitatus Act to consider. Introduced in 1878, this law prevents the U.S. military from participating in any form of civilian law enforcement unless it receives express authorization from either an act of Congress or based on the Constitution itself. As constitutional arguments would be easy to levy against the idea of using the military to tackle the gang problem, having the right to a fair trial could prevent many of the actions taken in El Salvador. The government would have to rely on congressional approval to use the military to take on American gangs. Granted, this act only applies to the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force, but that doesn't mean the government could use the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps with impunity. They're bound under a similar law, according to the Brennan Center. But there are ways around this act. Barring congressional approval, which would prove difficult to achieve given the divided nature of Congress, the Insurrection Act could provide a legal workaround to the Posse Comitatus Act. Under the Insurrection Act, a state government can request the aid of a federal military to help suppress an insurrection in the state. That act also allows the U.S. president to use the military to enforce federal law in a state, even without that state's approval, as well as to protect the civil rights of specific groups of people. There are also potential loopholes. Take the District of Columbia National Guard as an example. The only National Guard in the U.S. that operates under the president's control. All others are controlled by states or territories. The D.C. National Guard has a special militia status. That means it's considered non-federal despite being controlled by the president, and it's thus not covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. Could that provide a workaround for the federal government? All National Guard units could be granted the same non-federal status under the president's control before essentially being granted the military powers required to take on America's gangs. It's possible, though it would likely require a large amount of legal wrangling. Let's assume all these issues could be overcome. Would the military then be able to act as a police force in the United States? Perhaps, though it's arguable whether or not it would be bound by use of force rules. In an April 2022 article by the National Defense University Press, Dr. Patrick Patterson points out, most military combat operations are governed by law or armed conflict or LOAC treaties. The Geneva Convention is a good example. These LOAC treaties dictate what is illegal as a use of force on a battlefield in a state-on-state conflict. The problem? LOAC treaties won't apply if the U.S. uses its military to take on domestic gangs. Armed conflict isn't occurring by the terms of the legal military definition, even though any fight between the military and American gangs would involve violence and the use of firearms. This creates something of a gray area where the military is expected to operate within certain guidelines, but it's unclear what those guidelines might be. In this case, it would likely be up to the country's governments, both at the federal and state level, to decide the rules of engagement for the conflicts. We saw this in El Salvador. Its government not only opened the way for the military, but created a state of emergency and came up with new forms of trial to tackle gangs. The U.S. government likely wouldn't go so far, mostly because it would face a backlash if it traded away too many freedoms for the sake of taking on gangs. A state of emergency opens the door to human rights violations, as Human Rights Watch (HRW) points out in El Salvador's case. Specifically, it cites a conversation with a mother whose son was arrested in El Salvador, who claims that the police officers essentially told her, "We can arrest anyone we want." Therein would lie a major task for the U.S. government, finding a way to bring the military into play without infringing on the rights of citizens as enshrined in the Constitution. The point is, there are likely more barriers in store for any U.S. government that wants to use the military to tackle gangs than there are in El Salvador. After all, there's a reason why Nayib Bukele has referred to himself, albeit jokingly, as the world's coolest dictator. Despite El Salvador currently being a democracy, several organizations suggest that its democratic vehicles are slowly being dismantled. Felix Ulloa, the country's vice president, even proclaimed as much, according to the Wilson Center. He said, "To these people who say democracy is being dismantled, my answer is yes. We are not dismantling it, we are eliminating it. We are replacing it with something new." The U.S. isn't going to dismantle its entire democratic system to bring the military to fight against its gangs. But what would happen if it did? If all these legal, democratic, and human rights issues didn't exist, leaving the U.S. government with free rein to use the military to take on gangs, what would that look like? At this point, we can only speculate, though there are several routes down which the conflict could go. One route, which seems extremely unlikely, is that many fractured gangs throughout the United States somehow organize themselves into a united force to fight back against the military. That's a near impossibility. So much of gang culture revolves around territorialism, and trying to get the heads of over 30,000 gangs to all agree to join a fight against a common foe seems unlikely. Even if we focus on the largest gangs in the country banding together, there are major issues at play. Would the Aryan Brotherhood work alongside the Crips and Bloods, for instance? It seems likely that conflicts in gang culture and ideology would destroy any thoughts of joining up to fight before they got off the ground. Still, if that were to happen, a straight battle between the US military and the combined might of the country's gangs would only end in one way: a military victory. Even in terms of pure manpower, the military would have the advantage. It boasts 1.328 million active members, according to Global Firepower, as well as nearly 800,000 reservists. That's without mentioning the sheer gulf in equipment. These gangs would be bringing standard firearms, a limited number of explosives, and everyday vehicles to fight against a force that has tanks, jets, helicopters, and a navy. There's no question who would win. But that's also not what's going to happen. The far more likely route for the US military to take would be a regional approach that sees it cooperate with the FBI and state authorities to root out gang leaders and members and imprison them. In that sense, the military would essentially become an extension of the organizations the US already has in place. These organizations would be relegated to intelligence gathering, with the military serving as the hammer that hits the nail when it's time to make arrests or engage in direct conflict with the gang. It would essentially be a divide-and-conquer strategy, aided by the fact that American gangs are already clearly divided along territorial and ideological lines. However, there are challenges to this approach. To counteract the use of the military, gang members may go even deeper underground. Rather than operating with impunity, they would make a greater effort to blend in, leading to the military only being able to go after those with known affiliations. Even accounting for that, confrontations between the military and the gangs would happen on a street level, creating the possibility of collateral damage. Much of the military's strongest equipment, such as fighter jets and tanks, likely wouldn't be used so as to minimize damage to infrastructure. There's also the civilian issue to consider. According to the New Humanitarian, 6.6 civilians per 100,000 members of El Salvador's population died due to gang warfare in 2019, with that number occurring even when the initial crackdowns on the country's gangs were in place. It's not too much of a stretch to believe that the US military declaring war on America's gangs would actually increase the risk civilians face in areas where those gangs are most prominent. Any failure to arrest gang members or entire groups could lead to shootouts, creating the possibility of unintended targets being hit by both the gangs and the military. At worst, the military approach could lead to entire regions of the US becoming no-go war zones, where street-level guerrilla warfare is rife and the average person is in danger. El Salvador has experienced a similar issue. Its solution has sometimes been to place entire regions under siege. At least that's what happened in August 2023, when the country's military deployed to Cabañas to essentially lay siege to the area. Cabañas is a rural region that's slightly larger than New York, with the country's military combining with its police force to create what the BBC dubbed a security fence around Cabañas. All told, there were 7,000 soldiers and 1,000 police officers in the fence, placing the entire region in a sort of military quarantine. Nobody could go in or out without the military say-so. This idea of barring access to certain areas isn't new in El Salvador's crackdown. It regularly establishes checkpoints near areas that have known gang presences, with those passing through the checkpoints forced to provide ID and proof of address. Vehicles and backpacks are searched, as are bodies. The El Salvadoran military would strip search anybody it considers suspicious to check for gang tattoos and similar evidence. These checkpoints would also allow the military to build up a presence within the region, which proves useful when conducting raids on houses and gang facilities. Perhaps that would be a better approach for the US. Rather than fighting gangs on the streets, its military could establish similar checkpoints and security fences, allowing it to check up on anybody who passes through. Of course, that brings us back to the issues related to freedom of movement and freedom from government intrusion. Would American citizens be as welcoming of these intrusions as El Salvadoran citizens? And even if they are, would the military be able to dedicate enough resources to enforcing what amounts to regional martial law throughout all 50 states when it also has global concerns to consider? After all, nobody is looking to El Salvador to essentially serve as a protector for the rest of the world. It can dedicate a huge portion of its military to taking on gangs. Could the US do the same against a backdrop of a world that sees Russia fighting against Ukraine, Israel battling Hamas, and the raft of geopolitical issues those conflicts bring? Perhaps not. Finally, there are issues to consider outside the logistics of enforcing a military crackdown on American gangs. Take public opinion. According to an October 2023 Gallup poll, the majority of Americans, around 54%, believe that the federal government is already trying to do too many things that should be left to individuals and businesses. Gallup concludes that the baseline assumption is that the federal government is already overstepping its bounds, just in terms of regulatory issues and interfering with state policy. It's difficult to imagine an America in which the majority who want less federal government interference would welcome the idea of military crackdowns even if they were to dismantle gangs. There's also the prison issue. In April 2024, AP News reported that around 241 people arrested as part of El Salvador's gang crackdowns have died in prison, many without ever going to trial. That number might be even higher, with Humanitarian Legal Relief saying that it received reports of 500 deaths, though it's only able to confirm half of them. Another report covered by AP News goes deeper into the causes of those deaths. Almost half, around 44%, are the result of violence or serious torture, with another 29% occurring due to the deceased not receiving the medical attention they require while in prison. It would be naive to think such issues are absent in U.S. prisons. But even so, they are major human rights breaches that could become prominent. The Bureau of Prisons already believes its prison population will expand to 10% over the system's current capacity by 2024. Introducing up to 1 million new inmates into that already overcrowded system could bring prisons to their knees, opening the door for corruption or simple neglect as a result of the system being overburdened. For any military takedown of American gangs to actually happen, therefore, short of simply killing gang members on the street, capacity would have to increase to account for a near doubling of the current prison population. Still, all that might be worth it if gangs are eradicated, right? Using the military to destroy gangs would slow down the national drug trade and put a huge dent in the number of firearms deaths that occur in the U.S. every year. At least, that's an easy assumption to make. But it may not be accurate. While El Salvador may claim to have reduced homicide rates by 70% following its military crackdowns on gangs, it's unlikely that even a best-case scenario would result in a similar decrease in the U.S. That's according to USA Facts, which examined gun homicide statistics from 2021. Besides the fact that those types of homicides were at their highest in over 2 decades, rising 30% on the 2020 figures to hit a rate of 6.7 people per 100,000 in 2021, it also discovered something interesting. Very few of those gun-related fatalities were linked to gang violence. There is a caveat here. Of the firearms incidents for which specific circumstances were reported, 55% occurred due to unknown issues. It's possible that many gang-related incidents fall into this category, though it's equally possible that other circumstances led to those deaths. Of the 45%, 20% were attributed to arguments that turned fatal, while 14% were a result of domestic violence. As for gang-related deaths, only 3% were directly linked to drug dealing, with another 1% being gangland-related and less than 1% being attributed to issues with juvenile gangs. At most, that means that only 5% of the firearms fatalities in the U.S. that have confirmed circumstances were related to gangs. Those statistics demonstrate the key difference between El Salvador and the U.S., at least in relation to gangs. While gangs are a problem in both countries, El Salvador's gangs have reached the point where they could operate with near impunity. Plus, the country's government and justice system allowed for the implementation of martial law, which many in the country think is necessary because of the massive impact gangs were having on their everyday lives. Gangs obviously impact the lives of ordinary Americans too, and it would be unwise to suggest that there are no areas in the U.S. that are no-go zones due to the existence of gang activity. Still, gangs are responsible for fewer gun-related deaths in the U.S. than they are in El Salvador, which, combined with gangs not being a prominent problem in the lives of most people, suggests that sending in the military would be overkill. And that's not to mention the many issues related to human rights, civil liberties, and the federal government overstepping its power that could result from the U.S. using the military to take on gangs. So, would the military be able to help the U.S. clear up its gang problem? Absolutely. Even if it limits itself to working alongside existing law enforcement, the military has the training and equipment needed to take on gangs at the street level and potentially make thousands of arrests. The biggest question isn't whether the military would succeed, it's whether it should be allowed to try. We'll leave the answer to that one up to you. Let us know what you think it would take for the US military to start a crackdown on gangs. Is it even legally possible given America's democratic and judicial systems? And even if it was, would Americans be willing to give up their liberty, even if just temporarily, to eradicate gangs from the streets? Tell us what you think in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go check out how El Salvador Army destroyed their brutal gangs, or click this other video instead.